Thanks. My name is Adrienne Baumunk, and I will be presenting on cluster project performance, improving quality results in cluster project planning and management. A little bit about me. I've been a Wycliffe member since 2013, and I've formerly served with SIL in Papua New Guinea. I'm currently serving with Seed Company on the Pacific team as a field project manager, and I have been on this team for about 5 years. I serve partners in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. I formally completed a bachelor's in linguistics in 2013 from Trinity Western University in Canayel, and I have a master's in language and culture studies from Dallas International University. I finished up this degree in 2022 with a thesis titled Language Development Cluster Projects, a Mixed Methods Analysis. This is the basis of this presentation today. This research contributed highly to this presentation that I'd like to share with you today. The thesis can be found at the Dallas International University website at diu.edu in PDF form, and also at the Dallas International University Library on the shelves. The abstract, which you've already seen, is included in this presentation for future reference. This research was original research done by myself using Seed Company cluster projects. The variables that were under this research were the iron triangle variables of time, cost, and consultant check versus as the quality or scope of written language development projects. Another measurable were the number of languages included in each cluster, the versus planned and actually completed for each of the languages was measured, as well as the cumulative sum for those languages in the cluster comprised the cluster. The qualitative variables included in this study were the changes to the plan, changes to time, changes to cost, and changes to the number of consultant check verses, as well as the number of languages that either were added or taken out of the cluster project, as well as cluster project underperformance. This underperformance study included 12 projects that met less than 50% of the goals that they set for themselves in the cluster. The research included 72 cluster projects and included 336 language engagements. These language engagements aren't necessarily novel languages, but some are second phases or third phases of the same language groups. This research included $20 million in investment funding over 17 years of partnership with Seed Company. There were 1.1 million consultant check verses completed over the course of this study alone, but this does not include all cluster projects that have been partnered in by Seed Company. This is just a sample of those projects. All of these projects were completed prior to 2022, so there are no pandemic indications on this research. The research results will be briefly shared, but can be looked at further at in the thesis itself at the DIU library. The research results for time showed that 36% of cluster projects extended their timeline. For cost variable, 40% of projects came in under budget, 28% were over budget, and 32% completed as planned. For the consultant check verse variable, 58% of projects underperformed their goals. The goal for each of these three variables was to come in between 90 and 110% to be performing as planned. Less than 90% means that they were either completed in less time, they were under budget, or they were underperformed. If they came in over 110% for time, cost, or consultant check versus, they were extended on time, they were over budget, or they overperformed. The most shocking result of this entire study to me was the fact that 58% of cluster projects underperformed 90% of their goals. In looking at the changes to the plans, because we're always managing for change, here are some results that I found. There were 40 different time changes across the 72 cluster projects. Primarily, pacing issues, internal management issues, translation and linguistic issues, issues involving mother tongue translators, and time extensions required for multimedia production. Some cost changes. There were 84 across the 72 clusters, meaning more than one cost change incurred in some of these projects. Generally, these cost changes were to add or increase costs that were already in the project, to move funding between the fiscal years because activities have moved between the fiscal years, to accommodate for scheduling delays that impacted the budget, and seed company staffing or turnover issues. Some consultant check verse changes that incurred in these projects included cluster consultant check verse increases for the entire group, or language terminations, taking their CCV goals and removing them from the cluster. In the analysis for project underperformance, here are those results. I took an article by Boyaki and Liu on international development projects and synthesized that with the data provided in the quarterly narrative reports for projects that completed less than 50% of the translation goals that they set for themselves. In this synthesis, what I found was 100% of these projects faced issues of optimism bias, setting too high of goals, or being overly optimistic about what they could achieve over the course of the project. Some project staffing issues, stakeholder and involvement in planning, implying that the community stakeholders were not overly enthusiastic or even endorsing the goals in the project. 92% of these projects face poor project management, project complexity, and non-performing contractors, generally restricted to consultant issues and or data entry personnel. 83% of these projects faced weak supervision or poor project planning. These are items that I believe we can work on to mitigate issues into the future of cluster project planning and management. So what are some strategic considerations that we need to make when planning and managing cluster projects now and into the future? Here are my considerations for you. Consideration number 1, pace. Plan your translation pace accordingly. Consider your context, your team size, your mother tongue translator education, training, and skills, all available supporting personnel and their skills, the meeting location and the travel time and terrain it's going to take your teams to get there, and any type of strategy that you're engaging, whether it's a novel strategy or a time-tested strategy such as cohort consultant checking or cohort training. In addition to considering your pace, consider the area that you are working in. This slide shows you 11 operational regions that Seed Company operates in. Each of these represents a different part of the world. A, F, I, and K, these regions are the regions that use cluster projects the most based on frequency of use. However, their pace is their annual pace, shown here in the number of consultant check verses done annually in each region, is very clearly different. Region K can never operate like A, F, and I. They just do not pace the same. So consider the part of the world that you're in and the obstacles that you face, and consider that your pace may be different from the averages around the world. Consider that cluster projects will not operate at the same pace as single language projects. This slide shows that clusters on average are annually operating at completing 896 consultant check verses per year. Single language projects, however, are averaging about 1,075. This is not an advocacy for always restricting projects to single language projects. This is simply an encouragement to consider that as a cluster, you may pace slower than your single language projects in the same area or in the same context. However, there are many benefits to clustering that single language projects simply do not have, including camaraderie, unity, and the benefits of working together and interdenominational unity and encouragement. As far as consultants are concerned, this is my bumper sticker when working with consultants. Be clear with consultants, be up to date with consultants, and be ready for consultants. Being clear, outlining the consultant checking plan with them, outlining who's checking what language, and naming all of your consultants ahead of time can help you mitigate any lack of clarity down the road. Be up to date on all changes that the project is facing, any delays to the consultant checking session, or any changes to the books being translated and being prepared for those consultant checking sessions. Be ready. Prepare ahead of time and send the documents or the books that are ready to be consultant checked ahead of time to your consultant so that they can prepare for their part of the consultant checking session. Be ready for when they come to your community. Do not wait until they have already booked their tickets to cancel the trip. Be ready for them when they come, that you do not have other community engagements needing to happen that might interfere with the consultant's time with the team. Another consideration is regarding linguistics. Preparing your orthography, your tone, your script, and your spelling conventions ahead of time, making these decisions prior to the translation work as much as possible, can help you mitigate some of the issues that other projects have faced in the past, especially if there is any overseeing regulatory body or government that regulates these linguistic parts, especially when it comes to choosing or making orthography choices, choosing a script, or even the spelling conventions. Consideration number 4 is regarding translation issues. Outline your translation brief before you start on your project so that all teams are aware of the translation style and choices that they're making. If you are dealing with multiple dialects, encouragement to decide which dialect you're going to be translating with, or how you have in mind, or if you have in mind a dialect adaptation strategy in the future. If you're working as an adaptation, as a progressive adaptation, if you have one language in the cluster that is moving ahead and becoming the source text for the other languages in the cluster project, make sure that that team is equipped to pace ahead of those other languages. If you are also doing an adaptation strategy, make sure that you have your license or anything that you need approved in order to use the source text that you are using in that adaptation process. Consideration number 5 is regarding planning your calendar. Be sure to include in your preliminary calendar analysis all seasonal and weather interruptions, community church events, holidays, festivals, harvest seasons, election times, personnel commitments, including furloughs, family obligations, and school schedules. All of these things have been seen to interrupt the timeline and the translation process of other cluster projects in the history of this study. Also consider when planning your calendars, when you're going to commit to training and the translation steps, when the translation team is expected to produce the text that they are translating for the consultant checks. Consider when these teams will be able to go out and do community engagement and scripture engagement, and consider when they'll be able to integrate the feedback that they receive from the community. It's highly encouraged to plan all of this out on a 3-year calendar so that you can see over the course of time how things are expected to go, especially when it comes to international team members that might have furloughs when you are expecting to have a consultant checking session. Consideration number 6 is regard to management. Set SMART goals, specific and measurable, attainable, realistic or relevant, and timely. Allowing your team to be aware of those specific and measurable goals will allow them to aim for something very specific. Some cluster projects in this study did not set specific goals and use generalized language, and those projects suffered the worst from lack of productivity. Ask for what you need. When you're working with your partners, especially with partners that are providing funding or providing technical resources, be sure to ask for what you need, because they may not know. If you are operating on the ground and in the cluster project itself, and you find that you have a need that might be able to be fulfilled by one of your partners, be sure to communicate those needs to your partners. Equip the saints. Make sure that your translation teams have everything that they need in order to do the work that you're asking them to do. That goes from training all the way to data entry, and even time to pray and sit with each other and enjoy each other's company and build each other up. Face reality. Face reality both culturally and pragmatically. Sometimes projects fail. Sometimes projects suffer from unavoidable situations. There may come a point in which you need to face reality in a culturally respectable manner with the teams that you're facing. Also face reality pragmatically with your partners. They may not know what you're facing or what you're struggling with. They may need to know in order to communicate that to their partners. And consideration number 7, prayer. If you really want to know what's going on in your projects, in your partners, in the mother tongue translators that you're working with, you need to be praying together. Pray for one another and pray with one another. When you meet as a cluster, be sure that you integrate prayer as a part of that cluster strategy. Oftentimes, what I found in researching these details about cluster projects and the management, there was so much rich communication in the prayer requests and the praises. There were praises that helped us understand what was going well, and there were prayer requests to help us understand what was going not so well. Oftentimes, what you find is in multicultural contexts, you have a cultural restriction on communicating directly. Praises and prayer requests help you get around those cultural restrictions and understand what's really going on. Here are some helpful references and resources, and thank you for attending this presentation.